Welcome to our seminar, and I'm super excited to introduce Erica Fleishman. She is a professor in CEOs, and I met Erica a couple years ago, just as I started my job at Simmers, and Rick Spinrad said, "You need to talk to Erica." I was like, "Why? I know who she is." Because at that time you were heading the CERT-RISA, which is the NOAA climate adaptation project for the dry side of NOAA, and he was really wanting a coordinated dry and wet side approach to climate adaptation. Erica is, as I said, a faculty in CEOs, and her research is on birds of the Great Basin. Is one of the, you have actually a number of different taxa work with. And I thought, I'm sorry, you're in CEOs? So she is the most dusty pickup type that ever has been in CEOs, I believe. And I figured, hey, we have a lot of dusty pickup types here. And she is currently the head of the Oregon Climate Research Institute, OCRI, which does a lot to inform our state as to how our state's changing and what we should be doing. If you look at her Google Scholar, you see the full range of both taxa and methods that you use to study ecological patterns. I'm still kind of can't believe you're in CEOs because you're an ecologist, really. But I was really caught by this paper, Use of Macroecology to Integrate Social Justice and Conservation. So she's a broad thinker, and I'm really happy that she's here. We will go over to Mexico Lindo, is that the place? Afterwards for snacks and chat. And Erica's kindly agreed to be available Wednesday afternoon if faculty and students want to have a meeting for her. Faculty before 3, obviously. So a faculty meeting. And then the students after 3. And with that, let's welcome Erica.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and my pickup is hopefully getting less dusty in your parking lot as we speak. So this is informal. I have slides, but I don't need to hear myself talk. So if there are things that you all want to talk about as I'm running through my slides, just say so, and we will talk about that. So it would be really, really nice if the environment would adapt to us, but that is not the situation that we find ourselves in. And I was thinking last week about sort of people and land and how people have dealt with things. So this is a neat program where there's a group that is turning guns into garden tools. So turning literal swords, or well, in this case, guns, but think of them as swords, into plowshares. And I was thinking about the fact that that throughout history, as long as we know there have been people have kind of been jerks to other people. We kill each other over land, we displace each other over land, we kill and displace each other over religion. And people have been doing this, again, for basically as long as there have been people. So I started reading about sort of the biblical turn swords into plowshares and nations shall learn war no more. And came across just some websites that I was reading over the weekend. And one of the websites I was looking at made the point that to be able to turn swords into plowshares, 2 things really need to happen. One of them is technology. So you need the technology to go from a gun barrel to a garden tool. And then you need political will so that nations don't learn more. And I thought that was really apt. And I also thought, that's not unlike some aspects of climate change, where the technology is necessary to help people around the world have a good standard of living, and at the same time need the political will to be able to make these changes. And so I thought that would be a segue into spending a couple minutes talking about what OCRI does, because I'm at OCRI and not everyone knows that we exist or knows what we do, which is A-OK. So we were established by the state legislature about 15 years ago, and we are intended to be a network across Oregon's public universities. It is more difficult to do that, I've learned, than it was 15 years ago when we were established because of the ways in which the state has set up the higher education system. So it used to be easier to have money and people flowing among Oregon's public universities. Many of you probably know this better than I do. But especially now that it is becoming easier to actually interact with people again, we are trying to rebuild that network and have some good projects going with University of Oregon, working with some people at Portland State, and hopefully this will become more meaningful again. Administratively, we are also the home of the Oregon Climate Service, which is the office of the state climatologist. And I'm really happy to say that the legislature for this biennium gave us the first actual financial support for the Oregon Climate Service. And we're hoping that that will continue. And we work with state agencies, we work with federal agencies, we work with industry, all kinds of partners. I became interested over the summer in the extent to which OCRI's charge from the state in the bill that created us, which also created the Oregon Global Warming Commission, the extent to which that maps on to the land grant missions of research and teaching and engagement. And I believe really strongly in the land grant missions, kind of matching up what are the charges. Felt really good about that. So OCRI's teaching role, we're based at a university. Administratively, we're OSU, but intended to work across the public universities. So we participate in courses, we do lectures, try to support research assistantships for people at OSU and at other universities in the full range of sciences. So we have a social science intern starting up soon, and these are often paid internships. I don't mean, intern in the sense of please work your tail off for free. Physical sciences, natural sciences, what have you. We've tried to provide practical experiences and working directly with some of our state and federal partners for students. Lots of research. Our name is Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. And when I was applying for the job, it was sort of, wait, the state is funding climate change research. I would love this job. So we do all kinds of research. We are looking at things ranging from the effects of extremes on Portland General Electric's electricity distribution and transmission system, to looking at changes in the magnitude of river flooding and what this means. So really wide range of research, again, all types of sciences and their applications. So if you think of OCRI as just, people that are dealing with global climate models, no, that is not the only thing that we deal with. Something that I'm pretty jazzed about is trying to expand our portfolio in public health. So with a number of partners, we are hoping to be able to look at the effects on health of children in this case, because effects of various changes in climate or climate-related natural hazards, what it does to children is not as well known as what it does to adults. So we're hoping to look at both independently and in concert the effects of high heat and wildfire smoke and ambient ozone levels. So bringing together a number of things that are probabilistic related to climate change, and bringing together a number of things that are probabilistic in terms of dose response relationships with public health. So hoping to expand that program over time, and really excited about that. So next pillar of the land grant mission, outreach and engagement. We wind up doing a lot of presentations and a lot of discussions with the media. And I see the media as really our allies. The media is much better at getting the word out and of having a bead on what people are interested in than even very practical minded people who tend to spend most of their time at universities. So it's really rewarding to be able to work with the media and see what's of interest. I tease Larry O'Neill, who's our state climatologist, that every time it rains, he gets a call, or sort of how big was the hail today? But it's really a rewarding aspect of our jobs to be involved in that type of public outreach. We are working with extension, and like everyone at the university, just about. We also do a fair bit of outside service where we're wearing our climate and climate adaptation related hats. So for example, being represented in the National Climate Assessment. So that's kind of the what's going on with OCRI. And if people are interested in getting involved, pursuing ideas with us, collaborating with us, very happy to do that. We provide a lot of projections to counties and at the state level. So those are public and can be used in various applications. And the one very specific charge from the state is that every other year we produce an Oregon climate assessment. And so that looks at what is understood or what's emerging on the state of Oregon's climate, and what does that mean for human and natural systems. Again, if this is something that you have work that you would like to be featured in the Oregon Climate Assessment, the door has closed for the assessment coming out in early 2023, but lots of opportunities to be involved in the future. And although the state is very specific on thou shalt produce Oregon climate assessments, they don't dictate what's in those. So it's a really rewarding experience basically over time to be able to say, that sounds really interesting. We would love to include that in the next assessment. So please be in touch if you would like to get involved in any of these things. Now I'm going to segue, and I'm going to talk about places and systems and people that are extremely near and dear to my heart. So the title for this seminar, thank you to the late Senator Harry Reid. Because Harry Reid grew up in Southern Nevada, as he often discussed. He grew up in he grew up in poverty, and these places, the Intermountain West, really got under his skin. And this is something that I have found, that there are these places, they're not sort of conventionally beautiful. It's not like going to Yosemite and seeing the falls and going, oh. But you go out to these places, and if you're wired a certain way, they are stark and they are beautiful. And for me, I've worked in the Great Basin for 30 years now, and I was thinking, every possible human emotion I think I've had in these places. I have fallen in love there multiple times. I've broken up there multiple times. Had grief for people that died, and made friends, and everything. I think I've had every emotion there, and a lot happens over 30 years of your life. But this has been a constant for me of places and people. And it's an interesting thing, because there aren't many people in a lot of the places that we work in the Great Basin, which frankly I like about it. But at the same time, it's really hard for me to go out there now and not carry all of these experiences with me and carry these people with me. And so I feel like, I'm camping by myself sometimes in the back of my dusty truck. And it's just, there are all these people that I carry with me. So it's a really, really special place. And I really, in many ways, can owe my career to the foresight of Harry Reid. In the late 80s, early 90s, he was struck by all of the complications that the desert tortoise was causing for addressing trade-offs. This is overly simplified because I don't think it's a dichotomy, but environment and development in Nevada, or Nevada's economics and development. And he said, I don't want to have any more desert tortoises. I want to avoid those train wrecks. And he got in touch with a number of people that he trusted, and wound up developing something called the Nevada Biodiversity Research and Conservation Initiative. And what this did was bring together a couple of universities with federal and state agencies in the state of Nevada to try to collaborate. And so this quotation is actually from the obituary of my major professor, Peter Broussard, my PhD advisor, who, when you look at something like this now, you think, yeah, that's not really all that novel. Lots of groups are doing that. There are lots and lots of research management partnerships. In the early 1990s, this was not a common thing. This was a lot of foresight to be able to say, let's have these training opportunities for people that are early career. Let's make it easier for public and state agencies for federal and state agencies to be able to access university science, to get everyone clued in, to get everyone communicating on a regular basis. This, for its time, was unusual, and there was a lot of foresight. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Nevada as the Nevada Biodiversity Initiative was starting. And so really the way that I kind of look at applications of science and look at these systems go back to this type of foresight. Okay, so not everyone, this amazes me, not everyone is intimately familiar with the Great Basin. So this is obviously a larger area. This is the Western United States, but the Great Basin basically goes from the crest of the Sierra Nevada to the crest of the Wasatch Range, comes up here, kind of bottom of the Cascades, usually is cut off somewhere north of Las Vegas. Different ways of defining the system, whether you're looking at hydrology or vegetation or topography. It's called the Great Basin because in a general sense, all of the drainage is internal. So Mono Lake, Walker Lake, the Great Salt Lake, they're all internal drainage. It doesn't flow out to the sea. And you can notice a couple things here. This is basically an index of human activity. So there's not a whole lot of human activity or of intense development in the Great Basin. Reno, Boise, Salt Lake City, but a lot of it is not densely inhabited by human beings. Most of our work has been on what used to be, it's now the Humboldt-Toiyabe National Forest. It used to be administratively the Toiyabe and the Humboldt. When those two national forests combined, they became the largest national forest in the conterminous United States. So lots of land, not a whole lot of people. But it's an area where there have been resurgences of the state rights movement or the Sagebrush Rebellion. So sociologically, it's been a really interesting place to work. And it's a place that dashed a lot of my stereotypes going out there. So I grew up on the East Coast. I came west for college and then started working in the Intermountain West in places with few people. And I had my stereotypes and have found by and large that I am extremely comfortable in these places that people have literally told me, if we are in a public meeting, I am going to say some things in your general direction. But if we know that you're out here alone a lot. If you ever run into any trouble, you come to our place. Politics have no place there, So it's kind of a generosity of spirit and what have you that sounds cliched when I say it, but I have felt really welcomed, and I try not to talk about politics. So we've seen a lot of similar situations in Oregon in recent years. Well, over decades. But what was going on at Malheur a couple of years ago. And so in a lot of ways, although I'm fairly new to Oregon, Eastern Oregon is analogous enough to what I've seen in some other parts of the Great Basin to kind of understand what's going on there. Understand doesn't always have to mean agree, but it's really although there aren't many people in these regions, really interesting dynamics. I read something, oh gosh, it was either this morning or last night. There was a story in the New York Times about, I am trying to remember exactly what it was about. I think it was about development in Dixie Valley. So it's a remote area. And there were kind of a couple of comments about this town of Fallon, which for rural Nevada is a big town. And they were a little bit, in my biased view, a little bit snide about, here's this little podunk town. And it was kind of, well, hey man, wait a minute. And it's really easy to understand how you get the perspective on, those East Coasters don't get it. Okay. So I started working in the Great Basin, and when I started working in the Great Basin 30 years ago, I mostly worked on butterflies. That's what I had been trained in. I studied with people who worked on butterflies, and so I worked on butterflies. Butterflies are great. I love butterflies. They're fascinating. They're gorgeous. There's so many interesting things, a couple of things that I will mention, but people often hear statements like this. How many of you have heard statements like this? Butterflies are these great indicators of everything. No, they're not. One of the things that makes butterflies sort of a pain in the neck, although I love them very much, is they are like little weather vanes with wings. So a cloud comes over and their activity patterns change. There are all kinds of sensitivities to weather on a short-term basis, on a long-term basis, with time lags, what have you. So sometimes it's possible, if you're looking at a community level metric or a species level metric, to be able to explain that variability in terms of, to be able to explain the past variability in terms of covariance. But then if you tell people who study butterflies, if you could say, these are exactly what the weather conditions are going to be like for the next 3 years, how is the population going to respond, they're going to get it wrong. So they're really difficult because of that, in a scientific sense, because of that responsiveness. But it means that they're actually really adaptable. So here are some cool things that butterflies do. How many of you have heard things like butterflies are really tightly tied to a particular host plant, and if something happens to their host plant, they're toast? Usually not true. Evolution has taken care of that. So often there are alternate host plants. And so this is an example. Euphydrius editha in butterfly world. This is one of the best known species. I did my master's on this species. We call ourselves euphydriologists because we're a little group of people who study Euphydrius. So this particular couple populations of this species that are in the Sierra Nevada have two host plants that they can eat. So Collinsia, this one, great food source for butterflies that emerge early. So butterflies don't all emerge at once, a particular population. There's kind of a long emergence curve. And so some of them come out early, some of them come out late. Climate conditions are different. So there's also this host plant that's around for longer. And all of the individuals, basically, they can feed on either species. And there are some pretty interesting trade-offs in terms of if you're a female butterfly that gets to lay your eggs early in the season, this is a better bet in terms of host plants, but it's not around for very long. So you have options later in the season, but on these plants, the females lay their eggs closer to the ground because these plants get grazed by cows And so the ground is hotter. So basically you have this trade-off in terms of longevity of the plant itself and your eggs frying because the ground surface is hot. But so anyway, lots of details, but the point is they have options. They have trade-offs. They're highly adaptable. And both of these examples are work out of Mike Singer's group. Mike used to be at University of Texas. He's now affiliated with a couple different universities in Europe, and he is, I think, one of the most meticulous creative scientists that I've had the opportunity to know and to learn about. So this is a neat adaptation. So butterflies fly, and they're cold-blooded, so their muscles have to warm up enough for them to be able to fly. So they'll sit and bask, and many of you have probably seen this, but then they lose heat when they fly. And so this work illustrated that they were looking at this species, which is also a very well-known species in butterfly world, and the temperatures at which the individuals will take off to fly along elevational gradients and along latitudinal gradients. And what they found is that the butterflies take off at hotter body temperatures at northern latitudes. And they figured out why. It's basically the angle of the sun at different latitudes. So the butterflies can warm up at about the same rate at these different latitudes because of the way their bodies are positioned when they're basking. But when they fly, they're losing heat faster when they fly at higher latitudes. So for them to have the energy to fly, to find food, to find mates, they need to warm up more because they fly, because they're going to cool off faster. So there are all kinds of really cool adaptations where it's not just as simple as, what's the temperature? And so in terms of looking at climate change, butterflies, it gets much more interesting and complicated. So they are very fun. They are a little bit of a pain in the neck. You also may have heard things like, butterflies are vanishing. And this is a big old problem because they're pollinators. How many of you have heard things about butterflies being pollinators? Also not true. So very, very little evidence. It doesn't mean that butterflies never pollinate, but very little evidence that butterflies serve as pollinators. So where this seems to come from is bees do a lot of pollination, and bees are insects and butterflies are also insects. And so you can kind of get into this interesting messaging thing of, well, let's just refer to all insects as pollinators because then we can say they do great things and ask people to conserve them. So I ran across a really good, I thought it was really good, publication in political science that looked at, since there's basically no evidence that monarch butterflies do any pollination, why are they called pollinators? And they kind of deconstructed this in terms of the agency that it gives various scientists and NGOs and what have you, basically gives them political power to be able to say they're pollinators, even though it's not true. So one interesting thing though, I really try to be scientifically honest. So it helps to look like me if you're trying to go on people's private land to survey butterflies. And I asked a rancher one time in rural Nevada, can I go on your land to catch the butterflies? And, he looked at me and I seemed non-assuming and he said, yeah, that'd be okay. And he also said, those little yellow butterflies that are really pretty that I see in my alfalfa field, are they pollinating my alfalfa? And I took a really deep breath and I said, yes, sir. Under the circumstances, it felt okay. So birds. Our research group started looking at birds about 20 years ago, and the way that this came about, like many things, was really sort of happenstance. So I had a system set up across a number of mountain ranges in Nevada that I'll show you in a minute to be studying butterflies along elevational gradients and mountain ranges. And I didn't know that much about birds other than, birds are great, right? But I didn't really know that much about them as in terms of biology, study organisms, what have you. And a colleague who's also a really good friend who knows a lot about birds said, well, you have this butterfly system. What if we set up a bird surveys on top of that? And this was the era in conservation biology when people were looking at species richness correlations and where people were looking at indicator species. And he said, can we do a bird overlay? And I said, gosh, that sounds like fun. And it turns out that birds, for a lot of the questions that we've been interested in and things that agencies want to fund, birds are more amenable to that. So our group largely now works on birds. Although I do butterfly stuff whenever I get the opportunity or I can convince someone to give me some money to do butterfly stuff. So one of the outlines of the Great Basin is this outline here. We've worked here for 30 years in the Central Great Basin and 4 mountain ranges there. We also work on the western edge of the Great Basin and have done a little bit of work in some of the northern areas and the eastern areas. So most of what I'll be talking about today comes from these places. And I can talk about them for a really long time. So if you want to talk about the ins and outs of these places, I would be delighted. So bird data structure, if you want to know nitty gritty about our sampling, if you want to know nitty gritty about our analyses, happy to talk about it another time, but I kind of assumed that you would rather not be talking about that at 4:30 on a Monday. But it's worth just mentioning the data structure. So birds, we do point counts. If you think of kind of the prototype mountain range, you have a mountain range, and imagine canyons on the sides of the mountain range. The mountain ranges in the Great Basin more or less run north-south. The canyons more or less are on the east and west sides of the mountain ranges. Many of those canyons have a little riparian area in the bottom, although not all of them. And we set up points along the elevational gradient in those canyons. So it's kind of like a transect, except for birds. We're not sampling every single place along that transect. We're setting up points, and then we are listening, and mostly listening to birds along those gradients at those points. So we visit each point 3 times per breeding season. Breeding season runs from mid to late May, really late May to early July. So we have a short breeding season. Visit each point 3 times for 8 minutes. And for the past 5 years or so, we have split those 8-minute points into 4 2-minute removal intervals. What that basically lets us do is separate availability from detection. And so I will mention that get into that just a little bit. But if you have more questions, please let me know. We have points in the Central Great Basin. We have 370 points. We don't survey every single point every single year because we don't have enough money and people to do that. And because in a wet year, it's actually really hard to get into some of these areas because the roads aren't maintained. And there are stream crossings that will eat a vehicle in a really wet year early in the season. Western Great Basin started working on birds there a little bit later, but also have pretty good sampling there. And most of those points we've been able to do every year. We just added a couple canyons in the last year or two. So that's the overall structure. Much of what we have wound up trying to do is trying to reconcile computational capacity and advances in statistical methods, which we definitely take advantage of, with biological realism. So we really emphasize trying to see birds as birds and not as data points. And to say, okay, what species are we talking about? What do they do? How do they interact with their environment? We're not just saying, X number of species have such and such response, but why? Why these species? And so in terms of this availability versus detection, sort of the quick explanation, a colleague of mine, Frank Fogarty, who used to be a student in our group, put together this animation, which I think is really useful. So the general idea is that a lot of occupancy modeling is based on this notion that if you're surveying birds, a bird is on its territory throughout the entire breeding season and it doesn't go anywhere. It's just hanging out there. And so if you go to that, to an area that includes that bird's territory repeatedly, that bird is going to be there. And if you don't hear it or see it, if you don't detect it, it was actually there. And so what many of us are aware of, though, that go into the field is that birds move around. So these colored polygons are, they're intended to represent the territory of a bird, and the circle is where you're surveying. So you have birds, their territory is there, but they're not necessarily in your survey area right when you're there. They move around, or a bird from somewhere else comes in. So what we're trying to do is separate the probability that it was there and you didn't pick it up to the fact that, yes, it's the bird's territory, but it genuinely wasn't there when you were surveying. And those mean different things in terms of how you interpret the data. And it's been mathematically kind of interesting to try to deal with that. In part, it's hard to get models to fit. So one of the things that we have been looking at, there's this notion, well, not a notion, there are data that, that the distributions of some birds are shifting. This is an adaptation. I don't necessarily think that this is a bad thing. Sometimes I hear it discussed in terms of, oh my God, birds are showing up earlier. Or, oh my God, the distributions are changing. Well, that's not a bad thing. That's an adaptation. There can be challenges associated with that, but I like to think that this is hopeful because the animals are doing something to adapt to their environment. So this is based on latitude, not unfamiliar. We wanted to look at this in terms of elevation. How are the distributions of birds changing with respect to elevational gradients, which it often represents climate gradients? So I always like to point out that people have known a lot of stuff for a long time. So, if you kind of represent the schematic of elevational gradients, in terms of climate and in terms of vegetation, we thought, well, we have these transects along elevational gradients. They weren't set up to look at climate change explicitly, but what the heck, we have a lot of data, let's see what we can find out. And so we looked at two things. We looked at, again, we're looking at up to 20 years of data. So we wanted to look at, if we look at just first, let's look at where the birds are from year to year. And we want to look at changes in the distribution of individual species of birds over those 20 years. So there's this paradigm that birds are moving upslope in elevation over time. And so we had enough data to be able to look at these species, relatively small subset of the birds we detect because the models are hard to fit and a lot of species are not all that abundant. Anyhow, so for the birds for which we had enough data to be able to look at their distributions among years, they're moving downslope. We don't have any evidence of birds moving upslope over those 20 years. This is weird. So what's going on with that? What our leading hypothesis right now is changes in riparian areas or changes in plant productivity or perhaps vegetation structure and composition. So we think something is going on with downslope shifts in especially riparian areas. So riparian areas are about 1% of the land cover in the Great Basin, but they support about 70% of the native animal species, whether in an obligate sense or in a facultative sense. And our eyes are telling us that in many places, riparian areas are expanding downslope. So we're just starting to actually do the rigorous science to see whether what's happening is consistent with what our eyes are telling us. So why would riparian vegetation be moving downslope? Whoops, okay, sorry. Another thing that I was going to mention is that we have seen responses of, in this case, species richness of birds to area of riparian. So we looked at area and fragmentation of riparian and how they related to species richness of birds, kind of all in this context. And so this is kind of a classic, area fragmentation. What does it mean? But relates to land management in the region. And we also wondered, in these places, riparian has always been fragmented. It's more fragmented, but it's not kind of the classic, picture of what is in Caddis Township, Wisconsin, where many of you have seen this in textbooks of you had a more or less contiguous forest and then it was fragmented through human activity. And then you look at how animals or plants may have responded to that. In this case, we have every reason to think that riparian areas in this region have always been fragmented to some extent because it is a desert. So anyhow, what this is showing you, if you just look at things that do not cross the center line, we looked at area of two different types of riparian vegetation, wet meadows and woody riparian. We looked at a measure of this NLSI is a measure of fragmentation that is independent of area. So often fragmentation and area are pretty tightly correlated, and that makes analyses a pain in the neck. So we looked for a measure that wasn't correlated. So what this is saying here is basically that that it was riparian area, not riparian fragmentation, that was associated with species richness of birds. And also, every now and again, you analyze something and you look at the results and you go, that can't be right. So much to my surprise, we found what appears to be kind of a threshold in terms of the area of woody riparian that was associated with a sharp increase in species richness or a sharp decrease, if you want to look at it that way. So in these systems, whether we looked at a single year or multiple years of data, there seems to be a total area in these riparian canyons at which you see a response in species richness of birds. So all this is going to riparian area seems to be a big deal for birds. So the possibility that it's expanding at lower elevations is something that we think may be biologically meaningful to these animals. Why might it be expanding? Probably about 4 reasons, and reasons 1 and 2 are cows. So it's gotten harder to grow a cow in the Great Basin for many reasons, economics, climate, what have you. The data on livestock grazing are terrible. The best we've been able to do is to look at whether a grazing allotment was active or inactive in a given year and assume that if it was active, it was grazed. That's not a perfect assumption, but the data really don't exist. However, it is, I think, fair to say not everywhere, but in many areas, there are fewer cows than there used to be. And there's pretty good evidence from a number of studies that if you decrease livestock grazing pressure in riparian areas, if there's a decent seed bank, the riparian areas will rebound to some extent. We've also been looking at, this is a little bit harder to tease apart, although we're thinking about how to do it. The El Nino in the early 80s in a lot of these canyons, especially ones that have kind of harder rock surfaces underneath. This was a major scouring event. There was a lot of movement of soil. There was a lot of scouring. It's entirely possible that the vegetation still is responding 40 years later to those disturbances. 40 years is not that long in an ecosystem like that. 40 years here, you have huge trees and what do you mean it was 40 years ago? Anyway, very, very different system. So a couple different things going on. We're also thinking that in some cases, and there's some suggestions that this is happening in various places in the West and Midwest. So primary productivity and water use efficiency of at least C3 plants can be increasing in response to higher atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. This is entirely plausible. It's hard to evaluate whether that's happening, but that's another factor. So even if you hold climate constant, the plants may be responding to increased concentrations of carbon dioxide. So basically a lot of mechanisms that we're trying to evaluate to say, may riparian areas be shifting? Okay, the other thing that we've been looking at is within season movement of birds. So some pretty good evidence that a lot of species of birds are moving upslope just during the breeding season. So they're not sitting in those fixed territories for 6 weeks, but they're moving along elevational gradients, mostly upslope over those 6 weeks, except for green-tailed towhees, which are moving downslope. And we don't know what the heck they're doing, but they're the oddball as far as that movement. So this is a pretty consistent signal. And we have downslope movement among years, and we have upslope movement within years. Lots of possible mechanisms, again, probably related to phenology, primary productivity, what have you. We have a lot of ideas about why. But actually the first thing we need to do is figure out sort of if. So at the species level, we know that these birds are moving upslope within the breeding season. But all of our data are point count data. And so we have abundances, but we don't actually know what bird Bob is doing and what bird Jill is doing. We know that on the whole, the species is moving, but we don't know what individual birds are doing. And how we interpret what type of adaptation is the movement? Do you have birds coming in from elsewhere? Do you have the same birds moving? We need to understand who's actually moving, where they're coming from, what they're doing. And so we scratched our heads and said, well, how the heck are you going to do that? The topography is pretty rough, vehicle access is limited, just being able to blaze cross country on your feet is pretty difficult. So doing sort of the traditional Yagi antenna was not going to do it for us in these systems. So one of the people in our group said, well, what if we tag birds and we put little radios on them and we use drones? And that was sort of, hey, well, this is an idea worth exploring. So we're still in sort of the R&D phase of all of this, but how do we do this? Okay, set up mist nets. Hopefully some of you at least are familiar with mist nets. This is our lab dog, not my dog, but he comes with us, he gets acknowledged in publications. So you set up mist nets. Are you all familiar with mist nets? So kind of like a really thin volleyball net. The idea is to set it up in the early morning in a way that birds can't see it as they're flying around, and then they fly into the net. And birds are lovely, but they are not necessarily the brightest. So we spend a lot of time trying to lure birds into nets, which is legit if you're just trying to get the birds to band. You don't want to be attracting birds if you're trying to do general surveys. But if you're trying to catch a particular species of bird, it is totally fair game to do playbacks. Or basically you set up a speaker. Basically you're trying to convince a bird on their territory that a competitor is in their territory. And they get pissed off. They think they're flying toward that bird. Really, they're flying toward a speaker. And what they do is they fly into the net and you can catch them. So we spent a lot of time trying to outwit birds. I will say that in some cases, the birds outwit us for a long time. So this is a green-tailed towhee. that now is banded. And we probably spent 2 hours trying to outwit that bird because it would fly over the net, it would fly under the net, it would fly around the net. So finally, we got our bird. Anyhow, so what we're trying to do, we're getting the birds to fly into the nets, we catch them, all done with the appropriate permits, what have you. And then you go take the bird out of the net. It is so much fun to just handle birds. So this is Luke George. He has the master banding permit. He's worked with birds, for probably 40 plus years, and it is still just a joy to handle these birds, to just, hold this little life in your hand. It's also really fun for the students in the early career. Everyone enjoys this, just being able to actually handle the birds. But we handle them carefully, so do all the measurements, full compliance with all the data that US Fish and Wildlife Service wants when you're banding birds, and that we also have available for analyses. So we put color bands on them, we put the aluminum bands on them that tells you who the bird is, and then we affix small UHF radios to their backs. We're not using MODIS tags. If you want to talk about tagging and all that, happy to talk. The tags are still not as miniaturized as we would like. So we're limited in terms of which species we can tag right now, because you can have tags that are a maximum 5% of a bird's body weight. 3% is better, 5% is really the limit, and birds are really lightweight. So then you have birds that have the bands, they have the radio tags, and then off they go. So one of the people that's been working with us has just taken these great pictures of, here's one of our towies with the antenna on it. So, we know that they're flying with the antennas. We are still working out some of the drone hardware and software to basically be able to fly the drones overhead and get returns on these tags. So the drones are not up all the time. You have to have people trained, but it's been really fun kind of working out this system, and a really nice collaboration with people who have the expertise in engineering and the people who have the expertise in the biology. So more examples of us trying to work out the whole system. Part of the challenge for us is just trying to figure out systems that are portable. I mean, you're out there, you don't have electricity. So I am now the proud owner of a small generator. You're trying to figure out just how to make this a viable system where you don't have a whole lot of infrastructure, how to kind of miniaturize your elements, how to make them sort of bump around in the truck proof, all of that. So we've spent a lot of time trying to not break stuff, or to redesign components so that they're less breakable. And so this is a view of it. It's wild to be somewhere for 30 years and you've never seen it from above, and you just get a very literal different perspective on these systems. So this was us, the drone seeing us trying to figure this out. I just get a kick out of these perspectives. So we've mostly focused on lazuli buntings and green-tailed towies. The lazuli buntings within breeding season seem to be moving up in elevation to the greatest extent. Other people have seen this in other parts of the Great Basin, so they also seem to be moving upslope in the Wasatch Range. And they're just heavy enough to be able to carry the tags. So lazuli buntings and green-tailed towies have been our beasts. And so then, sort of what do the data look like? So green means that you are basically this is where the bird was. We had eyes on abandoned birds. This is where the bird was. These colored dots are the returns that we were getting from the drone, picking up what we mounted on the drone, picking up the bird's radio tag. And so basically green is you're getting closer to the bird. So we're getting, basically we can figure out on the basis of signal strength and what have you, where is the bird? So we know where the bird is, and the data that we're getting back from the drone is suggesting that the bird is somewhere around here. The reds are sort of, yeah, I know the bird is around here somewhere, but it's kind of localizing to here. So we're fairly pleased in general. We still have a lot of kinks to work out, but we're fairly pleased with the overall information that we're getting from this system. So another challenge we have, you'll notice here, lazuli bunting with color bands and not with a radio on its back. So it used to have a radio on its back. Lazuli buntings are smart. And or at least they're crafty. So the lazuli buntings seem to be able to figure out how to get the tags off their backs. So we're now trying to figure out, okay, how do we lazuli bunting proof the radios? Green-tailed towies, their tags have stayed on, but of the maybe 8 or so lazuli buntings that we had tagged this year, half of them figured out how to remove their tags. So this is kind of gratuitous. This is also a bird that used to have a tag, but I just love this photograph. And so I wanted to show it because darn, it's a good shot. I think one of the criteria for working in our group is being able to take fabulous photographs and let me use them for presentations. So there you have it. That's what we're doing. I'm really enjoying working on it, collaborating with people on it. Happy to talk about this, happy to talk about any aspect of our research system, ideas that you might have, what have you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about my favorite things and places.
So why don't we open up for questions, conversations?
The riparian area data, that's super surprising to me. Like that's very counterintuitive.
Yeah.
So what about, again, maybe all this is fake news, but information about dropping water table levels and sort of the parching of the West. And
Yeah.
shouldn't that be impacting riparian?
This is surprising to us too. This is why we're starting to put some effort into it. Combination of land use and climate change and how individual areas are fed and what have you. These areas were pounded really hard around the late 1800s. And definitely there have been places where the depth to groundwater has increased in large part because of land use. Whether there's a response to some of that pressure being alleviated, a really slow response. These are super variable areas. I mean, it's tough. We know that climate change is progressing, but it's tough to say at what point does the level of climate change, sort of become too great for the system capacity to more strongly respond to a change in land use. I don't know, it's tricky and it's really place to place. And we don't really know in a lot of these systems, the extent to which riparian vegetation is capitalizing on surface water versus groundwater. So there's definitely groundwater. No one really knows how these places are plumbed. There are a lot of seeps. There's a lot of snow pocket aspen. I mean, what they're tapping into, I don't know. And I can point to places that seem drier over time. I can point to places that don't seem drier over time. I don't know. But it definitely seems like even though some places, you look at the surface water and it's sort of, well, maybe it's becoming more ephemeral, but my eyes are telling me that the riparian vegetation is expanding or that there's more understory. There's an area where we spent a lot of time, and a couple of years ago, two of us who have been out there a lot, we were wandering around just kind of taking a walk, and we're seeing this plant, and it's sort of, what are we seeing here? There's this plant that seems abundant, that didn't used to be abundant. And it's not like we haven't spent time here before. And like, what is this? And we realized that it was cornice, that it was dogwood. And we're thinking, we didn't used to have dogwood here, but it's all over the place now. So, I mean, it's native in the system, but like, what is going on? There's now this really robust dogwood understory. Dogwood can grow in areas that are drier, relatively speaking, along the riparian gradient. But I mean, what's contributing to this? I don't know. So, we're trying to, at this point, again, take it from, more or less informed anecdotes to, is this really going on? Is it widespread? What the heck's going on? It does seem counterintuitive, which is in part why it's fascinating. What the heck's going on?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I don't know if you've come across Michael Schaffer's work at Northern Arizona. He's developed a drone telemetry program that triangulates automatically. Seems like it'd be useful for locations. And it's just,
Yeah, potentially so.
maybe it's tricky with the elevation change, but anyway.
Yeah, it's surprising things are tricky. Wind is tricky.
Yeah.
You can't fly in high wind, and it's rare that we have really calm conditions.
Right.
We're also challenged, again, we don't have electricity. So we're challenged by the battery life. a drone battery, we can fly on a drone battery for about 15 minutes.
Right.
And so, I mean, we're hauling this generator out there and spending a ridiculous amount of time recharging batteries.
Yeah.
So just trying to figure out, is there a way to be more efficient? Is there a way to, in a sense, reduce the payload on the drone so that we can get more battery time? Yeah, some weird things that we have to work out in terms of the logistics. And everyone that flies a drone needs to have an FAA license. So, you have to kind of invest in just getting people up to speed. You can't just have a bunch of warm bodies flying the drone. So that's not quite, I mean, I didn't quite need it that way.
Yeah.
Not anyone could do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So aren't these riparian areas in the range and basin connected? So sorry, my background's from like New Mexico, where we actually
Yeah.
think of like sky islands, right?
Yeah.
Where like it's desert in between and you think
Yeah.
of like, but are they also like, are they connected to each other, or are the mountains, I guess you work on flighted species, so I guess the mountains aren't really that much of a,
So
but
yeah, it's interesting. So everything, I mean, it is sort of analogous to the Sky Islands, and the work that's been done over the years. I mean, these mountain ranges used to be conceived of as, islands in a sea of sagebrush. And the paradigm was that they're isolated. And work that's been done on every taxonomic group over time has suggested that they're not that isolated, at least over evolutionary time. So looking at mammals, yeah, periodically they cross the valleys. I mean, it seems really large, but you do the linear distances and it's not that large. And we'll see just weird stuff. So, I mean, the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of marmots. We've seen a lot of marmots at low elevation. And I saw a marmot crossing this one valley that's pretty dry. And it was sort of, what on earth? So I got back to somewhere with internet and I wrote to a couple of friends that study small mammals. And I said, why was there a marmot here? So you just see these things of periodically they cross. I've seen, periodically riparian butterflies way the heck out of habitat, and so it happens. I mean, they're isolated kind of on a day-to-day basis, but over evolutionary time and even just, over a couple of years, there is some movement, certainly for things that have wings, but even for things that don't have wings.
and kind of a follow-up, do you think that that's going to change like under climate change, or how do you think climate change might affect the connectivity of these kinds of systems? Does it seem like it's going to get worse, better?
I think these animals are creative. So this is just me speaking. If anything was super sensitive, it was gone in the late 1800s. I mean, the land use changes in my mind were so massive at that point. There was such transformation from the mining and the cutting down of, every tree, and from, really extensive sheep and cattle grazing, what have you, but probably the stuff that couldn't make it, we don't know what was there. So the stuff that's there is, probably fairly tough. And it's a fairly harsh environment. So I don't know. I'm not saying ever, but if you look at the next couple of decades, I am relatively hopeful that these organisms kind of find a way, at least over a couple of years to get around. And you still see, if there's a not so much a storm, but a wet spring or something like that, a remarkable amount of overland flow. And so I think, my sense is that these plants and animals, they're capitalizing on whatever they can get. They're kind of primed to go, let's go. I don't know. I'm actually fairly hopeful. I'm not saying that climate change is not a stressor in some ways, but there's just so much variability in the system and so much creativity in nature that I'm fairly hopeful.
Very good. Species distribution models, it seems like we use it a lot. Everybody does one. But I feel like what you presented tells us that, well, there's some underlying processes that are probably maybe not quite well captured.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense like how wrong might we be? We just use a snapshot and then project forward.
Pretty wrong. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the species, I don't know, they're sort of modeling of species distributions, and there are a lot of them that are just based on climate variables, and they're based on climate averages. And I don't know any organism that responds to average climate. So yeah, you can run the models and they might not blow up. Are they going to really be all that accurate? I don't think so. And you get into something like birds, where generally speaking, something is known about vegetation structure and composition associated with them. I mean, there's generally more information. So I guess it depends how well informed is your species distribution model. I mean, are you doing something that's moderately species and location specific, and you can use a fair amount of ground data and sort of tune it to different of those n-dimensional hypervolume. Well, can you get a bunch of different dimensions that are physical, that are biotic, that are interactions, what have you? Can you get a bunch of those? And then maybe what you're explaining and projecting is okay, versus something where it's, I have a handful of eBird records from 2 years and a bunch of climate averages, and I'm going to throw them all into a model. And I can get a projection and I can make it spatial, but that's great. Yeah, I think there's that those they're not a bad starting point maybe, but I don't know the ones that don't have pretty robust field data and don't really think about the biology of the organism, I don't necessarily think are going to be all that helpful, at least for some applications.
You tell it like it is.
What's that?
I need you to tell it like it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's not satisfying. You can't run, 150 species that way, but we've also found, and we've looked at this a number of times, as have other people, that you can kind of lump species on the basis of general vegetation or land cover associations, or lump species on the basis of what do they eat, or I mean, you can basically make these guilds or functional groups or what have you, and look at, do the species within that group respond in similar ways to X? So we did this with some bird data in Southern California and said, if we look at trajectories of certain climate variables over the past, I think it was 50 years in this case, do the species within that functional group have similar responses to that climate variable? Not so much. So a lot of variability species to species. I mean, saying, gosh, they're all associated with chaparral, they should all do the same thing. Not so much. Which again is not really satisfying, but it also is satisfying because they're all different. If they were all the same, they wouldn't be different species.
Other questions? Well, let's thank Erica for telling us that other flags aren't real. We're going to head over to the